Good evening and welcome to the Clergy Round Table of Naples United Church of Christ. My name is Dawson Taylor, and it is such a privilege to welcome you, and it's also a privilege to serve as senior minister here. And it's great to be back from vacation, and Angela keeps acting like she's really happy to see me. So thanks for holding things together, although I also have been told it's like I wasn't even gone. So.
No, the office was much
Quieter. Yeah,
with
that's
you
usually
not
what I'm
around,
told. Yeah,
but we
no.
missed you.
No,
We
it's great.
did manage to hold things together. The building is still standing. So,
Yes, I
but
never worry about that.
it's good to have you back.
Thanks. It's good to be here, and it's good to have my colleague and friend, Reverend Angela Wells Bean, and we're grateful to our production team for making all of this possible. And we are in the midst of our Lenten book study based on the work of Atul Gawande and his fourth book, being Mortal Medicine and What Matters in the End. And this is our third session, and I think, Angela, just to, recap kind of what we've learned, or I guess what I've learned, and obviously I don't speak for you, you remind me of that often, but the thing that I think what has really stuck with me in our conversation with Dr. Bob Nordland, a physician, and then Barbara Converse, a nurse, is, this idea that it seems so often in our culture, in our society, we are intimidated, scared, not only of death and that transition time, but to talk about it. And, this concept of dying well and what that looks like, not only for the person going through it, but for the family, for those who love them. And I think sometimes for the caregivers, physicians, nurses, and we'll have further conversation about that today. But I think, I think one of the things that you and I have both talked about is if we can open up that dialogue and those conversations in a healthier way, that perhaps we can help people make those decisions, have those conversations, and acknowledging that those conversations are multifaceted. There's legal, financial, health, lots of things around that. What stands out to you, or,
I agree with you. I would say a lot of our society's denial of death is rooted in fear.
Yeah.
And we talked about how because of modern medicine, we have become so separated from the act of dying and being around dead people that it is an unknown entity, and people are afraid of the unknown. And so I hope that our conversations really help to kind of demystify what the last days, weeks, months of our lives are like, and to empower people to talk about what we want the last phase of our lives to look like and how we want to die, because everybody dies. Nobody gets out alive, and lack of decision making is a decision in itself. And so to take ownership over how we want to live and how we want to die and how we want, or how to carry out our loved ones' wishes, because it's often at the responsibility of someone's loved ones to, make sure somebody's wishes are carried out, that we are able to have those conversations in a healthy way. And you and I are both pastors, and, we serve, and this visual podcast is hosted by a church. And so we've had a lot of conversations about faith and how having a strong faith can help, make death not fearful, not something to be afraid of, and to almost embrace it and look forward to what comes next. And that's very much wrapped up in our theology. I mean, because death and new life are central to the Christian story.
I was really struck by what you said a moment ago about not making a decision is making a decision. That in of itself, right, is you are making a decision, whether that decision is to not engage and not respond, or to run in fear.
And decisions will be made for you.
Exactly. And, I think we talked about this, if I remember correctly, we talked about this with Barbara a little bit as she talked about, caregiving for her mother as she transitioned, her spouse, her first spouse as he transitioned, this idea you and I talked about of when families come in to meet with us to talk about memorial service, and and we sit down and say, now what are some things that are important to your loved one to have at a memorial service, and they say, I don't know, we never talked about it. And
Right.
when we say, oh my gosh, please talk about those kinds of things. So yeah, and and then as you were saying, which is a great sequitur of the theological grounding, and Atul Gawande I think does some great work about also what you alluded to and Bob Nordland did a phenomenal job talking about is, physicians are taught to fight against death, and that it's the great, you know, evil one to go against. But Atul Gawande in his work here is trying to change our mindset that it's not always how we have to look at it. And in the theological grounding, and part of why I'm grateful that we're looking at this book in this season of Lent, which is this time for us to center ourselves, to think about death in the midst of new life and resurrection.
Yeah.
And so I'm really grateful because someone who I think can help us have this conversation in another aspect to add to this really rich conversation is a dear, dear friend of mine. I'm not going to say he's old friend, but he's a longtime friend. And that is Brandon Wallerson, who is actually, so the last 2 weeks we've had people in person. The last 2 weeks of this podcast, week 3 and 4, we'll be joined by people virtually. And so Brandon is joining us from Austin, Texas. So I'm really grateful that he has taken time and taken time away from his family. So Brandon and I go back way further than either of us want to admit. And we actually went to undergrad together. And I actually met him the first day he walked onto campus. There's a famous story about me making fun of him, but we are still friends to this day. I had the great privilege of officiating he and his husband Scott's wedding, and have grown to adore their daughter Addie, and am just deeply grateful for their friendship. And Brandon is a licensed social worker in Texas, and as I said, we went to undergrad together at Centenary College in Shreveport, Louisiana, and then his master's in social work is from the University of Texas at Austin. And then Brandon, you just recently started a new job, and I didn't print out your very impressive biography, but you just began a new job at Dell Medical School at University of Texas at Austin. What is your title, your new title?
Yeah, so the title there, I'm assistant director for institutional community relations, which basically I'm really a bridge between the school and the community in all the ways that we need to do a better job of creating opportunities to bring people in, to invite people into the story of the med school, because everyone is part of a story of a medical school. The whole reason we exist is to improve the health of our community and to encourage folks to see that health is not just what happens inside of a clinic, but it's what happens in all of our communities, in our churches, in our faith communities, and in school, and where we live, where we work, where we play, all those things. And so, yeah, the job really is sort of being more of a bridge builder and a connector between the school and the larger community.
Well, and I know you've done tremendous connecting work in Austin because you've lived there now since you started graduate school, so many years.
Yeah, since 2004.
Yeah, that's really remarkable. But a part of what I think the richness that you bring to this conversation, and really why I wanted to invite you to this conversation, is the social work aspect. Before you went to the medical school, you did a tremendous amount of work in HIV/AIDS work in the Austin area. And I remember, I'm thinking about your work at Doug's house and in an HIV/AIDS or AIDS specific hospice work. And so I'm thinking about, as we talk about this idea of transitioning from this life to the next, and how you've walked that journey with people who were actively dying, people who had families that had to make decisions, and then people who unfortunately had to make those decisions, perhaps not with family of origin, but with family of choice, or perhaps alone, different things like that. And I just wonder if you might reflect a little bit, and then we'll get into some specific questions and things like that.
No, sure. It's interesting. I've had quite an extensive career. I always tell folks I took a non-linear path, as most of us do, but my social work career actually started in hospice and then has since sort of worked in reverse and more preventive work and sort of systems level health related equity work. But yeah, so my first job was in hospice, and really really enjoyed that work. I did an internship at Doug's House, which Dawson just mentioned. Doug's House is the AIDS hospice program of Project Transitions, which was really at the time designed to be a hospice program, a residential hospice program. But they soon sort of found, as folks were responding to medication and treatment, that they had to provide other housing opportunities for folks, because folks were again sort of coming into Doug's House and stabilizing, getting on their medications, getting access to medical care and social support services. And so then it became this essentially like a wraparound component that hospice was still there for sure, but that other aspects for adjustment into the community and to again sort of getting back into a regular pace of life. And so the unique pieces that HIV work brought within the hospice setting was, I think, unique to probably what a lot of other folks might experience with hospice, which might have been more a traditional sort of linear path along sort of, you get a terminal diagnosis, you have a limited diagnosis that has been given to you, whereas sort of HIV presented somewhat of a conundrum, because folks would be told that they were nearing the end of their life expectancy, only to then find out that they could come to a place that had a loving supportive staff and volunteers, and access to medication, food, housing, all those things. And we would see them get better, and we'd see them again transition out of a hospice state. So I most definitely saw people at the end and held hands and did all those things that you were talking about, Dawson. But I also had the very unique opportunity of sort of being in this sort of generational shift from folks who were at the end stages of their disease, only to then be given a new lease at life, to be able to then transition out and provide opportunities and access to a new life that they quite honestly never even envisioned. So it was a very unique time, I think, in life, and sort of generationally, with sort of treatments and advances that we were seeing. And I will never forget that. And those really moments sort of, stayed with me. And I imagine we'll get to some of those specific memories. And I do hope so, because I have some easy ones to recall. So, but again, I know there are other components you want to get to, so I will stop there.
Great. Well, so part of what we want to talk about this week is this idea that Gawande gets to in chapters 5 and 6, where the chapter titles of chapter 5 is A Better Life, and chapter 6 is Letting Go. And in chapter 5, Gawande talks a lot about interconnectedness and talking about the idea of retaining purpose and meaning. And I'm really struck about that, where you talk about, which I knew, but I hadn't really thought about, in this idea where people who have a long-term illness, where they at one point are told that they are perhaps immediately terminal, and then that's not the case. How did you, in your social work side and in your direct work with one-on-one with patients, how did the issues around meaning and purpose, how did that come up, and how did you deal with things like that with people who were potentially believing, or who were told and believed that they were at end of life, and who perhaps are still alive today 20 years later? Mm-hmm. Or 18 years later?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It is interesting. So, it's sort of framing it from the perspective that that you sort of you're at a point where you're reflecting on, on a life, maybe not what you wanted, not what you hoped for, but nonetheless, it's what you're facing and what you're dealing with, only to then find out that you get to reclaim your life and your purpose, and that that you're actually going to be able to leave Doug's house in a on your feet, walking out the door, saying goodbye to a place that you thought was going to be your final home. And so it really I think there are so many, conversations, around that, and the hope that comes with that. But also, I think that it's still to be clear, like it's still very volatile. That folks really, it's not that. I mean, if you don't have housing, you don't have access to resources, that life can continue to sort of, remind you of your state, and that again, having those access to those critical resources, are so critical, and that, without those, you could end up back at Doug's house again, back in a state where you are, thinking that your days are numbered. And so it was just sort of this interesting, kind of dance of like recognizing that, yeah, there's opportunity and there's hope, and also, the same systems that enabled the situation that the residents would find themselves in, they have not we've not cured all those systems, and we've not, remedied all those issues. And so I think, there was definitely there was a cyclical nature at times when you would see folks who would come in, and, then they would get better, and they would leave, and again they encountered the same systems that were creating barriers and challenges for them to begin with, and then, we'd see them again, right? And so it did create this sort of cyclical, kind of nature for some. But though for many, I mean, I probably, when I think about my memories of the sort of reclaiming, sort of hope and opportunity, I remember the specific resident that, she actually transitioned from Doug's house into the apartments, the transitional apartments, and we had a hospice graduation ceremony. And again, not something that I think most folks sort of, when they think about hospice, they think of it very much like, it's term limited, and, there is a a noted end date, at some point in the near future. But for her, right, we were able to get her access to medication and housing and all those things. And, we had a graduation party, and it was amazing. And I remember, for that specific moment, that we went to her apartment, and she had, one of those like karaoke machines, and we all had to sing a karaoke, song, right? Some song. And so she wanted me to sing. She picked Madonna for me to sing, and so I sang the Madonna song, and still remember going back to that, to write the notes, the documentation for that visit, and like thinking never in a million years would I've ever like social work sang Like a Virgin with with resident as sort of the kind of the capstone to that whole experience. And I still think of that. And I think, again, for folks who thought that there was no hope, to be able to provide that for them, and that experience for that moment in time, was really something that again, I will never forget.
And Angela, I'm thinking about, we recently had a church member's parent who was in hospice care, and like you say, there's an anticipated departure date, and he kept going and going, and finally hospice came to the family and said, he's not actively dying.
He's failing out of hospice.
Yeah, he's failing
I
out of
think of
hospice.
graduating from hospice as dying.
Well, that's what I think of, is like, I love
Yeah.
this image of graduating from hospice. And, as we were talking about earlier, or mentioning earlier, this idea, if we could more readily accept this idea, sociologically, psychologically, and and theologically, of graduating from hospice, or this idea of graduating into the next life. How people, that might help us.
A celebration.
Yeah, celebration. That might help us grasp the idea of transitioning or dying more easily. I don't know. I'm just really struck by this idea, Brandon, of a graduation party in different ways.
And thinking of death, not as something, again, not as something to be afraid of, not as something that is sad, but as something to embrace, and kind of celebrating someone into the next life. And I remember my grandfather's death was a very good one, and he died from Alzheimer's disease, and we were at his bedside in the assisted living facility where he lived for many years, and our family surrounded him and basically sang him. We gave him permission to let go and to die, and sang him into the next life. And we stood around his hospital bed and held hands and sang. And then we left, and about 15 minutes later, we got the call that he had died, and it's kind of like accompanying them as far as we can onto the next phase, and then trusting that the ancestors or that God are grabbing his hands when we have to let go. And one thing I wanted to mention, Brandon, that I appreciate from you, and you're bringing up your work with AIDS, is that so far in our conversation, it has been skewed towards people who have illnesses, who have ample medical resources at their disposal. And, Gawande says the one thing that medical doctors are reticent to offer is nothing. And he's talked about kind of how these practitioners are just, especially with people who have seemingly terminal illnesses like cancer, are just, pushing more and more supposedly curative treatments onto them. But we haven't talked about the people who live with either terminal illnesses or live in a state where they can't get the care that they need because of societal factors and systems and homophobia or economic disparities. People simply can't afford the medical care that they need, and they don't have the problem of care providers pushing cures on them, but they have the opposite problem of not having access to what they need. And I think it's Dawson, with all due respect, I love your preaching, but I'd kind of like to have Dawson preach have Brandon preach an Easter sermon, because just going into Doug's house and thinking you're dying and not even knowing that there are these medical resources available, these medicines, these treatments, and then having access to them and walking out. If that's not an illustration of new life or life after death,
resurrection,
resurrection, exactly.
It's interesting just hearing that story. I was thinking about a friend of mine who has been an HIV leader, LGBTQ health advocate for many, many, many years. He's also a long-term survivor of HIV, and he talks about this story, which is just really, nothing I think puts sort of a framing on this. Again, sort of the HIV context to end of life care that this story does, because he talks about being in a hospital bed in his room at home, and again thinking life was pretty limited for him. And where his bed was in his room, he was right out where he could see this bed of flowers. And he talks about sort of when watching this sort of winter transition into spring and seeing the tulips bloom, and that the tulips blooming was like a metaphor for him, because he was like, he could see that this growth and literally transformation was happening before his eyes with the flowers. And then he himself was getting access to medication and able to really to get better and to really improve. But that story to me is just so telling of a whole generation of people who thought their outcomes were different, and that were able to find hope, reclaim purpose and and meaning. The sense of those tulips blooming just get me every time.
Yeah. And I think, Brandon, about, something that your biography doesn't talk about, but because of our friendship, I know of your work in, and I will likely mess this up, but the Austin Area HIV/AIDS Council, correct? Or Ryan White funding, and
it's the HIV and Aging conference that we founded. To this point of that, we would see folks again that, how was a system responding to a whole community of people who were, quite frankly, not dying, and were actually living longer lives, getting older, having chronic issues that, might have been connected to their HIV, but the HIV itself was not going to be the thing that led to the end of their lives. And so how do we ensure that, a whole community of service providers and organizations are ready to deal with people, deal in a sense of like, to ensure that services are equitable and affirming and are meeting communities, where they are. And, it's been a joy. We just had our 10th annual conference, which was not something any of us ever really envisioned happening. It was just more that we just wanted to have conversations and be a bridge between the HIV communities and the aging communities. And I think we've made a lot of progress. And to your point, Angela, earlier about the stigma piece, because I think there is still so much stigma, and just breaking down the stigma around disease, around chronic illness, around a whole generation of particularly of gay men who essentially were going to be coming into these communities and ensuring that again, services were equitable, they were affirming, they were appropriate, and they really met these communities where they were, with acknowledging of their life stories that for many of them thought that it was not going to turn out the way that it did, and it's much more hopeful. But at the same time, ensuring that they've got access to all those key services that are needed.
I think about it in chapter 5, Gawande talks about this idea of being independent and being autonomous and independent versus the connectivity, the interconnectedness. And I think about both my experiences in the gay community, but specific to the caregiving that's required, particularly if you've been rejected by family, if you've been rejected by the medical community, things like that. And I wonder, you can speak to this specifically, especially from your background, Brandon, and from your social work. What does that look like for someone who is raising and facing some of those more significant questions about their own independence and having to rely on others when perhaps how they have survived thus far has been as an independent person?
Well, it's not easy, and no one is the same. But I would say that of the residents that their stories really stuck out the most during my time at Doug's house, which again is we're talking over 2005 through 2010 from my internship there, and then coming back as the house manager. But the stories that really sort of sit with me are the ones that the residents had been alienated from family because of coming out. And oftentimes for these residents specifically, it was coming out as both gay, living with HIV, and with a terminal diagnosis. And so for so many of them, it just it just created so many divisions, unfortunately, with their family because of homophobia, because of transphobia, because of all the phobias and isms that keep us from each other. The story probably, there's the graduation story that I mentioned, which is really something. And then the story of Willie probably is the one that he and I had a very, to the point of talking about how folks sort of come in and out of hospice. And, he was on my caseload for about 5 to 6 years over the course of my time really at Doug's house as an intern, and as the house manager, and seeing his life, someone who grew up in East Texas with a large family, and when he came out, very alienated, kicked out of the house, ended up living in LA for a while, was homeless for many years, and he had different times that he was at Doug's house over the course of the time that I knew him. And but his final, I would say his final stay, literally his final stay with us, he didn't have anyone. He had no one, no friends other than us, his professional family, if you will, that were there for him. And I remember when he had a disability check, and there's just there are certain ways that school can prepare you for being a social worker or being a minister or whatever your role is, but there are also many things that just cannot. And that was a moment where we his last check, he had received his payment, he had cash, and he was like, he asked us to go buy him a suit for his funeral, and to then give the rest of his money to the nonprofits that had served him well over the course of his life. And so I remember like going to Burlington Coat Factory to get his suit, and he wanted a specific hat that he wanted to wear. And in Austin, and I don't know how it is in Naples, but there is what essentially is referred to, and again, this is probably not the right term, but a pauper's cemetery. And that's essentially where, folks who don't have access to resources, family supports to pay for a funeral, for a gravesite. And so there we were, his family of caregivers, singing him home, if you will. And I just will never forget that moment in the suit that I had bought with his last check that he'd gotten in with his professional family surrounded his gravesite, with the chaplain from hospice. And that was just, again, another one of those moments that just sort of seared in my memory. But a fiercely independent person who, ended up having, a life that probably he did not necessarily ask for, but in a community that ended up surrounding him with love and gave him what he needed at the very end. So.
Wow.
Powerful.
As Angela says, I think I'd rather have Brandon preach on
Easter I know.
Yeah.
But one thing I appreciate you bringing up, Brandon, I don't think you've said the words purpose or belonging explicitly, but those are two themes that I'm hearing in the stories you're sharing. The first being purpose, and Gawande talks about this. I believe it's also in chapter 5 that this is fundamental to our survival, is the need for purpose and
He does talk
accomplish
about
something.
This in 5, yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
No, I'm just saying, I remember
yeah.
that really stood out to me.
And so I'm wondering, with the clients you had who, were living with HIV, came to Doug's house, probably thought they wouldn't leave Doug's house alive. And then, like, as you said, got this new lease on life. And then you probably have seen these people throughout the years who came back to this conference, who've lived for decades, who never expected to. And can you speak to how, and again, I'm not asking you to speak on these people's behalf because that's probably not fair, but I'm just wondering what it must be like for somebody who's given a terminal diagnosis, thinks their life is over, probably isn't thinking into the future because they don't think they have one, and then they're given this gift of new life. And how does that shape their perspective going forward? Does that affect the difference they want to make in the world, or their purpose they're seeking out of life, or maybe their appreciation of life and not taking it for granted? And so I would just love to hear you speak. And also the second thing I was going to mention was belonging and needing a place to belong. And that is, it seems to me that, as you called them, the professional family that you offered to that gentleman who you bought his suit for him, that you gave him belonging in Doug's house, and how invaluable that is to feel. And that's when we lose our loved ones because they've banished us, that, losing our sense of belonging can be almost as shattering as a death sentence, saying like, I exist on this earth, but I have no place to call home. And so can you speak to those, both and or purpose or belonging?
Well, it's interesting. I was thinking as well, because like when you think about, a whole generation of gay men in the, early to mid 80s who faced an HIV diagnosis collectively as a generation of gay men. I remember sitting on the porch at Doug's house, speaking with one of the family members, or the friends of one of our residents, and he was talking about how many times he had sat on the porch at Doug's house and, was, reflecting with folks around, his various friends that had gone in and out of Doug's house, or, had died at Doug's house, and sort of, this survivor's guilt that exists. And, for him, it was, that it was just palpable, the sense of like, why not me? Why am I not the one that's in the room dying? Um, and at the same time, sort of facing that question, and also being able to be like, you know, but look at what you're doing. And he had gone to school, and then he'd become a notary public, and he was really serving this sort of this key sort of space of like, as folks who were dying, who needed to get affairs in order and get all their important sort of paperwork sort of notarized. And I just remember like he had really, for a whole like group of people that he knew, and people that were just strangers in Austin, and he was able to provide this really important service to ensure that their wishes were honored, and that what they had left was going to the right folks in the right spaces. And I remember sort of just the many conversations that we had sitting on that porch, reflecting on his life. I think that the sad part of this conversation again is when you think about the systems that sort of led people to Doug's house in the first place. Access to healthcare, all the phobias and isms. The they didn't miraculously get better when the residents, if they improved and left Doug's house. And again, so for some, yes, for sure there was purpose, but for others, again, it's sort of they were back into a society that didn't accept them, didn't love them, didn't appreciate all that they brought to the world. And so for many, right, it became kind of a circular process. And so I think that's the hard part when we think about the work that we need to do as a society, that it really is it takes all of us, because we have to address these the ills of our society, because again, these folks are still gonna go back into a community that neglected them to begin with, and created some of these challenges and barriers. And so yeah, I think that is a challenge, I think, that we all have in these moments when these folks were able to really bounce back and kind of have these opportunities that didn't exist for them. Yes, that's true, and that's great. And at the same time, we have a lot of work to do still to ensure that the community is loving and is accepting and is providing all those opportunities. Again, back to creating this HIV and aging conference that created this sense of like, okay, we're going to have conversations between these HIV organizations and these aging organizations to ensure that again, the systems were adapting to allow for these folks to enter them, and to be cared for, and to be loved and respected and valued, so that they could again contribute positively and have great outcomes and find community and love and support as they aged.
Yeah, I mean, two themes that just keep bubbling up to me in this first part of the conversation are this idea of how important purpose is and remains to continue to drive us in our lives, no matter what stage of life you find yourself in. And so how does that part of the conversations around death and resurrection and the end of life, what does purpose, what does that look like? And then the other, and as much as I like alliteration, I didn't exactly plan it this way, but as I'm sure Angela is recognizing, one of the many things I appreciate about Brandon is how he keeps in front of me how privilege plays into so much of our culture and our society and what happens around us. And so how those of us with privilege are called to address the needs of those who do not have that privilege. And again, as Brandon's pointed out to us, the systems that are at work, that also plays into the dying process, that plays into the things that happen along the way. And so there are often two different worlds or three or four different worlds. People with privilege, I think, can look at dying one way. Those without privilege, they don't have that luxury necessarily. And I don't know. I mean, those are just, I don't have any deep answers or something. I don't know. Those are just things that keep popping up to me as we progress in this conversation.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate, Brandon, you bringing your perspective on privilege as well, because that hasn't been the focus of our last two conversations. But it occurs to me that having the ability to choose to live well and die well are both things that are afforded to people with privilege.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
That I certainly take for granted. Having, I have an ache or a pain or I'm sick, or having the ability to go see a care provider is something that is denied to so many people. And the reverse of that is saying, okay, I'm ready to die for whatever reason because I have this terminal illness. My body is wearing out, as Gawande says, and choosing to deny medical treatment is also a place of privilege, because there are so many people for whom death is imposed upon them by no choice of their own because they don't have access to the care that they need. And how our systems are so broken. And Brandon, we've focused a lot on your work at Doug's house, but I'd love to hear about the work you're doing now with the medical school, because as you said, health is so much more broad than, going to a clinical setting. It's the food we have access to, it's lifestyle choices, it's, mental health, which we're going to talk about, next week when we bring our psychiatrist in as our special guest. But there are all these aspects that create determine our health outcomes, and those of us who have access to them have privilege, and that access is certainly not evenly distributed across the board in our society. So Brandon, would you tell us a little bit about the work that the medical school is doing? I presume to sort of grant that access to more health improving measures to more people in our communities.
No, that's great. To be clear, I'm not in any way a ordained spokesperson for the medical school for this conversation, but
so all things you say use your own
yeah,
views.
Exactly.
You want to offer a disclaimer?
Totally. Can we have a little rolling text box at the bottom? No, I would say, again, I think when we think of, I was just thinking about the conversations around purpose that we were having, and clearly, like, conversations when you were surrounded by people who are facing the end of their lives, if you're not also having your own existential questions about purpose and worth and meaning, like, then I'm not sure you're fully present at those at those times with your loved ones, because it really does sort of force, I think, a conversation and reflection. And I think, as it relates to HIV specifically, I was thinking about sort of, when I entered my time, at Doug's house, not necessarily anticipating that was going to be my internship, or that was going to be this path that was laid out for me. We were coming off of, really 10 solid years of some amazing medical breakthroughs with HIV treatment. And so that, was affording a lot of this kind of hope and opportunity for this community, but at the same time, they were sort of in this space between this, like, well, is it a death sentence, or am I going to live? And like sort of hold that space, if you will, for them, for the community, and quite frankly, for a profession, right, that sort of in many ways has sort of shifted to this, chronic preventive, illness, that has so many opportunities for prevention, and really the advancements that we've made in HIV treatment and prevention really are mind-boggling. But so to be able to then think about, okay, well, if hospice maybe isn't like the true path for this, or at least that, like, that there's so much more promise or opportunity from the systems perspective, and engaging sort of upstream and the work. That was for me how I started thinking, like, gosh, well, maybe investing in these communities, at a preventive level, at a systems level, is more palatable, is more can be while it can be more difficult, it may be more time consuming. It also can be more I think more transformative in many ways. And so yeah, like the ability to sort of find hope and promise in a career that in many ways for me has had to shift because again people were living longer and they needed more access to other systems and other supports and other communities, and so ensuring that the systems are designed in a manner that while still provide those opportunities for folks who are still dying, most definitely are working to ensure that the preventative measures are in place, the anti-stigma work is happening to prevent that from ever happening. And so that for me has sort of been a kind of a reclaiming of purpose for me, is like, yeah, the community's investing on the front end at the systems level, at the very macro level. It's so important, it's so needed. And yeah, I mean, again, it's a really great opportunity to be like, yeah, we're going to end HIV one day, and hopefully we're going to witness that in our lifetimes, and that is in no small part because of the generation of folks who have gone before, who faced difficult circumstances, a government that wasn't responding quickly enough, who
Hmm.
was not nimble. The government was not nimble when it should have been and could have been, and but nonetheless, we persisted, and things are in so many ways getting better, and yet there's still so much farther to go. So yeah, it's really it's an investment at all levels of the conversation.
No, I truly appreciate your insight. And again, your tremendous work on that. And circling back to some of a second part of Angela's question, you know, Dell Medical School is, if I understand correctly from our conversations recently, was started really as in a communal effort, a community-wide effort in Travis County in the Austin area, and as you said in kind of your introductory remarks, really focusing on the entire community, trying to provide some of that preventative care, as we talk about purpose, things like that. What are some of the ways that, here in Naples, Collier County, we're doing a lot of work with blue zones, which is how how we eat, how we get out and exercise, how we connect with people, things like that. And that was started by Naples Community Hospital, or brought to us rather by Naples Community Hospital. What are some of the ways that Dell Medical School and through the university and others how are you all addressing that in your community?
Well, I would say, it starts with, as a medical school, education, ensuring that the curriculum that the medical students are being taught is from a holistic perspective that is informed by um, lots of perspectives and lots of, importance of again, treating the person holistically, thinking of all
Mm.
aspects of their lives and all the ways that to bring health to communities. So you think about it at the education level. You think about it creating pathways for people to go into careers of service that are in hospice and palliative care, and also in HIV, in areas that maybe were not necessarily a lot of folks may not necessarily be signing up for, but creating opportunities to where you almost provide some different perspective to open people's eyes. In particular, I'm thinking of med students, that there are opportunity and that there is hope in these professions that might not otherwise be seen as hopeful professions. And so I think in many ways it's sort of investing in that community and those resources to ensure that future generations are passionate and have the information, the resources to meet the patients, to meet their community, where they are, because we're living through a moment right now where as part of the COVID pandemic, that we are in many ways informed by the infectious disease work that happened, from the HIV generation, from the early days of
Yeah.
that, where like everything connects. And so the ability to again sort of bring this perspective, but also bring the hope that comes with, again, meeting communities where they are, giving them the resources that they need, and the language and the mechanisms that meet them where they are truly, and not what we think is what they need, right? Listening to communities, engaging deeply with communities, um, is really super important. And so yeah, that is the work of the med school, right? Is in improving the resources in this area in Travis County and Central Texas around medical education, and providing ways in which more and more doctors, more and more health professions sort of kind of demystify some of these things that might otherwise sort of keep people away from signing up for this type of work. That's like, look, we all have a part to play, and this is super important. And this is just one area, right? That folks can get engaged and can learn about, this aspect of caring for our communities more broadly.
You mentioned it, thank you for that. You mentioned as a part of that, and of course as part of your background, and Angela specifically in her portfolio works in our congregational care area. But I'm curious, I still think, and maybe it'd be interesting if Angela has pushback on this, but I think hospice still has some stigma around it. When families or an individual or a couple, makes a decision that their loved one is going to make the decision to enter hospice care, it's a death sentence, or they are. The hospice is there to kill them, or I mean, I've heard it all, or I think I've heard it all, heard a lot of it, and so I find hospice to be such a tremendous gift, both in their knowledge and their compassion and how they handle the whole person, the whole death process, the whole transitioning process, and so I don't know. I just wonder how we might continue, because I think part of how we demystify the dying process is again, particularly, although I know there are organizations that help people have access to hospice care who don't have privilege, but especially those with privilege who access hospice care. How do we demystify? How do we talk in better, healthier ways about the work of hospice and help demystify? Because if we're going to demystify or help demystify the dying process, I think we have to demystify the hospice care process. And as someone who not only has worked in it, but I'm sure has had those conversations with families and individuals, I mean, what has been your experience in that? Because Gawande talks a lot about that in the second chapter for this evening, the 6th chapter.
Well, I think that there is a layer of vulnerability that I think is required, that folks have to be willing to kind of look at their own mortality, and sort of face some difficult conversations. You can't, again, sort of look deeply into, a loved one's eyes as they're facing the end of their lives, and sort of not, again, not have some of your own existential questions about about your own life. I would say that the more we put it off on someone else to do, that creates, again, this disconnect for us to have to face these own sort of difficult questions. I would say that now then, this comes from my own perspective as someone who's been a hospice social worker for many years, but being in that environment and seeing all the different, I mean, I would have at any point, I would have 40 to 50 patients on my caseload. No death was alike. Nothing was, there were some similarities for sure, but every person is unique. Every death is unique to that person. And so, it's important, I think, to not make broad generalizations about, well, my family member had this, X, Y, and Z, then therefore this is the same for everyone, because I can tell you that it's not. And I can tell you that there are lots of surprises, that come both in the way that someone lives out their final days, to the way that family dynamics emerge that maybe didn't exist before, things that aren't said that come to light. And so again, I think some of the demystification comes with us being vulnerable with our own situation, our own mortality, and our connecting deeply to someone who is facing the end of their lives will demystify so much. But that in of itself is a big barrier, because we're not wired for that. I think maybe we are wired for that. I'm hearing Brene Brown's voice in my head. We are wired for the vulnerability. We are. There's so many barriers that emerge through the course of just everyday living that create that disconnect. And so, yeah, I think the demystification comes in the more proximate we can be and get with people who are dying. And it's not easy, but it's important.
Brene would be so proud, Brandon.
Maybe she can be a special guest on Clergy Round Table one day.
Yeah, maybe she will.
Oh, gosh, wouldn't that be great? I'm really struck by, on this topic of hospice, Gawande is talking to a hospice. I'm sorry, I don't remember actually who this quote is from, but the person says, a hospice nurse has 5 seconds to make a patient like you and trust you. It's in the whole way you present yourself. I do not come in saying, I'm so sorry. Instead, it's, I'm the hospice nurse, and here's what I have to offer you to make your life better. And I know we don't have a lot of time to waste. And Brandon, you keep talking about vulnerability, and it says they have 5 seconds to make a patient like you and trust you. And I think there's no quicker way to trust than through vulnerability, and to be candid and honest and say, you know what, you're dying. We're going to make your life as good as possible now, and we don't have a lot of time to wait. It says a hospice social worker, can you relate to that? Like having to form a connection with your patients quickly?
Well, if I'm honest, I was a little triggered by that.
Okay. Well, no, I appreciate that.
I just feel like, and maybe it's because as a social worker, the perspectives that we bring, yes, we're resource driven, and we're definitely action-oriented people, but also we don't come with medication. We don't come with moving someone in their bed, or getting up for some activity. Like, we're just there. So I think in some ways, while yes, it's important for a team-based approach to caring for someone, I think the unique perspective that a social worker can bring, or a chaplain, or someone who's not necessarily like a clinical, like I have an intervention other than my presence, that I think it goes in tandem. It works in teams with those folks who do have to sort of act so quickly. I don't want to discount that, but I can tell you, patients will very quickly, can tell if you're there quickly to sort of, if you're checking boxes, or, it's sort of, it's like, I've got 3 more patients to see. They can smell that out pretty quickly. And so I think it's really important to be able to, in some ways, just build relationship and build connection when you can. And that's just, you can do that with just your presence, just physically walking into a room and trying to not be so preoccupied with all the things that are going on. And so, yeah, I think my challenge to that, I hear that comment, and I also just challenge it to be like, well, when you can just come in and just physically sit and be present with someone, I think that can really go a really long way in building that connection. And yes, you don't always have, days, weeks, months to be able to build that. I can tell you that in my experience, those opportunities did come, and I was able to have those, really truly relationships that built over time, that were definitely perfect to begin with, and built connection with and trust with the patient, with their families, established the vulnerability, established a sense of connection, and those I think were the more transformative moments, when there was the opportunity for that connection and that relationship to develop over time.
there's some fascinating work done on chaplain and clergy visits in hospitals. You may be familiar with it about when you sit down versus when, excuse me, when you stand up at the bedside, and how the patient responds, and the follow-up work that was done about their perception of how much time you spent in the room, and whether you were listening or not. And so much of it had to do with whether or not you were sitting versus standing, and it's really
I'm
fascinating.
not. I want to learn more about
Yeah,
that.
it's really.
I always try to sit. Is that the right thing to do?
Because
Okay.
it's eye to eye, and the perception being that you're not just, as Brandon said, you're not just moving on and checking boxes.
Yep.
Like, I have 5 more visits to make on this, on this floor or whatever. And I don't know, that's what really struck with me. Well, Brandon Kyle from Calhoun, Louisiana, it's so good to see you, my friend. Thank you for your wisdom and your vulnerability, and please give Scott and Addie my love, and my parents send their best, by the way. And
Excellent.
And I will look forward to hopefully seeing you guys this summer. And thank you for the tremendous work that you do to make the world a better place. And again, thank you for being with us. And we want to say thank you to those who have joined us either live or who will pick up on demand and join from watching the archive. We hope you'll join us next week for our 4th and final session. And we look forward to the perspective of a psychologist, also bringing an psychiatrist, excuse me, who's also Angela's uncle. So she's invested in me getting that right. But also bringing an academic perspective of doing some of the research about end of life and how we approach that. And so we hope that you'll be back with us next Wednesday at 5 p.m. Also inviting you to join us for worship on Sundays, and also for our midweek meditations on Wednesdays at noon, all available virtually and, of course, in person. And again, thanks for being with us. See you soon.